When Cordelia Weston's daughter-in-law sold the family home without warning, she walked away with everything. The furniture, the savings account they'd shared, and 43 years of memories nailed to every wall. Cora was left with one thing nobody wanted, a crumbling carriage house at the back of the property, so old and broken down that Sabrina Voss hadn't even bothered including it in the sale. She laughed about it, actually, told Brennan it was worthless. What Sabrina didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the carriage house held a secret that would unravel everything she thought she'd won and hand Cora the kind of second life that most people only read about. Stay with me until the end, because what Cora found inside those rotting walls didn't just change her circumstances. It changed who she was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Cordelia Weston had turned 64 the previous spring, and she'd celebrated the way she celebrated most things in recent years. Quietly, in the kitchen of the house on Sycamore Ridge Road, with a slice of pound cake she'd bake herself and a phone call from her son that lasted 11 minutes before he said he had to go. Brennan was busy. He was always busy. Cora understood that, or she told herself she did. The house had been the Weston family for 31 years. Cora and her late husband August had bought it when Brennan was still in diapers, a wide two-story colonial with a wraparound porch and more square footage than two people ever really needed. But August had loved space. He'd grown up crowded into a small house with 5 brothers and had promised himself that one day he'd live somewhere with room to breathe. Sycamore Ridge had been that place for him. For both of them. August died 7 years ago. A heart attack on a Tuesday morning in November. Fast and, without warning, the kind of death that doesn't give you time to say anything you should have said. Cora had rattled around the house alone after that, keeping his chair at the kitchen table, keeping his reading glasses on the nightstand longer than she should have. Grief does strange things to a person's sense of time. Brennan had moved back to Millhaven 2 years after his father's death, bringing Sabrina with him. They'd met at a sales conference in Atlanta. Sabrina was sharp, polished, the kind of woman who knew the price of everything and kept a running tally in her head. Cora had tried to like her. She'd made the effort, invited her to Sunday dinners, asked about her work, complimented the way she dressed. Sabrina received all of it with a thin smile and said very little in return. The first year went smoothly enough. Brennan handled the yard. Sabrina worked long hours and came home distracted. Cora cooked most evenings and tried not to feel like a guest in her own home, which was harder than it sounded. Sabrina had opinions about furniture placement, about the curtains Cora had hung in 1998, about the way Cora stored her cast iron pans. Small things. Cora let them go. The second year, the conversations shifted. Sabrina started talking about equity, about what the property was worth in the current market, about how sitting on an asset like this didn't make financial sense. Cora listened and nodded and didn't say much. She'd grown up in a generation that didn't argue about money at the dinner table, and she wasn't about to start. Then Brennan sat her down one evening in March, in the living room where she'd nursed him through chickenpox and helped him with algebra and watched him open college acceptance letters, and he told her they were thinking of selling the house. Cora looked at her son for a long moment. The house your father and I bought. The house you grew up in. Brennan had the decency to look uncomfortable. The market is really strong right now, Mom. We could get a great price. You get your share, and you could use it to move somewhere more manageable. Smaller. A senior community. Cora was 64 years old. She still grew her own tomatoes. She asked for time to think. Sabrina, who had been standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, said they needed to move quickly because they'd already spoken to a realtor. Cora went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought about August, about the way he used to say that the house would be there for their grandchildren, that roots mattered, that a family needed a place to come back to. She thought about the marks on the doorframe of the kitchen pantry where they'd measured Brennan's height every birthday until he left for college. She thought about the garden August had planted along the south fence, which still bloomed every May without anyone tending it, as if it remembered him. She thought about all of it, and she knew, somewhere beneath the shock, that the decision had already been made. Sabrina hadn't been asking. Brennan hadn't been asking. They'd been informing her. The next 3 weeks moved with a speed that felt almost deliberate. A realtor came through the house, and Sabrina walked her from room to room while Cora sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee she couldn't taste. An offer came in within days. Brennan texted her a number with a string of exclamation points, as if the price was the point, as if the point had ever been the price. The closing was on a Thursday. Cora wasn't invited to attend. She found out it happened when a moving company showed up at 9 in the morning, and a young man with a clipboard knocked on her bedroom door and told her she had until 4 o'clock. She called Brennan. He didn't answer. She called him again. He texted back, "Mom, we talked about this. I'm sorry it's hard. Sabrina found you a place? I'll send the address." Cora put the phone down on the nightstand next to the spot where August's reading glasses used to sit, and she stared at the wall. Her neighbor and oldest friend, Henrietta Okafor, Hetty, who'd lived 3 houses down for 26 years and had brought food after August's funeral every day for 2 weeks, showed up within the hour. Someone on the street had seen the moving truck and called her. Hetty walked in, took one look at Cora's face, and didn't say anything for a full minute. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." Cora told her. She needed to know what was hers, if anything was hers, if there was anything left at all. That afternoon, going through the files August had kept in a lockbox under the bed, the kind of lockbox a man of his generation kept for documents he considered serious, Cora found the deed to the Carriage house. It was a small structure, maybe 700 square feet, sitting at the rear of the property behind a stand of overgrown cedars. August had converted it decades ago into a workshop, then stopped using it, then let it sit. The main house deed had been in both their names, which meant Brennan and Sabrina had been able to handle the sale as co-inheritors after August passed. But the Carriage house deed, filed separately in 1987, had been put in Cora's name alone. August had done it that way on purpose, she realized, though she couldn't remember him ever saying why. It hadn't been included in the sale. Sabrina had glanced at it during the realtor walkthrough and waved it off. Old outbuilding, no utilities, probably not up to code. Not worth the hassle of including it. Cora read the deed 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She had somewhere to go after all. The apartment Sabrina had found for Cora was on the 3rd floor of a building on the east side of Millhaven, the kind of building where the hallways smelled like someone else's cooking and the walls were thin enough to hear the television next door. Clean, functional, forgettable. The kind of place a person passes through, not a place they land. Cora stayed there for 11 days. She paid the first month's rent from savings, unpacked 2 boxes, hung nothing on the walls, and spent most of her time at the small table by the window, looking out at the parking lot below. She ate crackers and soup. She slept badly. She called Hetty every evening and talked until she felt steady enough to say goodnight. Brennan called once on the 4th day. He asked if the apartment was comfortable. Cora said it was fine. He said Sabrina was already talking about renovating the kitchen in the house on Sycamore Ridge, and Cora realized he hadn't called to check on her. He'd called to ease his own conscience. She didn't say that. She said she was glad things were working out and let him go. On the 5th day, Cora drove back to Sycamore Ridge. Not to the house. She parked on the road and walked through the gate in the back fence that August had built in 1992 and stood in front of the Carriage house for the first time in years. It was worse than she remembered. The cedar siding had gone gray and was splitting in long vertical cracks. One of the 2 front windows was broken, the opening covered with warped plywood pulled away from the frame. The roof over the small side addition had partially caved, taking the gutter down with it. The original barn doors August had been so proud of were swollen shut and laced with rot along the bottom third. She walked the perimeter slowly. Vines had climbed the north wall to the roofline. A bird had nested in the gap where the soffit had pulled away. The whole structure leaned slightly to the east, as if it had been tired for a long time and was finally giving in. She went back to the apartment and called Hetty. "I'm going to live in it," she said. Silence. Then Cora, "Honey, you can't live in that." Hetty knew Cora well enough not to argue when her voice got that flat, certain quality. August had recognized it too. Not stubbornness exactly. The sound of a decision that had already finished being made. "What do you need?" Hetty asked, the same question she'd asked 11 days ago in the house on Sycamore Ridge, and Cora loved her for it. Cora made a list. Then she called a lawyer. Patricia Osei worked out of a small office above the pharmacy on Central Street. She reviewed the carriage house deed and confirmed what Cora already knew. The structure was hers outright. The land it sat on, a strip of roughly 40 feet by 80 feet at the rear of the original lot, had been filed as a separate parcel in 1987. August had been meticulous about it. The sale of the main property had no claim on it. Patricia also told her something unexpected. When Sabrina's realtor filed the sale paperwork, they'd flagged the carriage house parcel as an unresolved title matter and simply excluded it. They hadn't told Cora. They'd hoped, Patricia suspected, that Cora wouldn't notice or wouldn't know what she had. She knew, Cora said quietly. Patricia looked at her over her reading glasses. I think she assumed you wouldn't do anything about it. Cora thought about Sabrina's dismissal during the walkthrough. Old outbuilding, no utilities, not worth the hassle. She thought about the way Sabrina had always looked at her with a brand of patience that wasn't really patience at all but tolerance. The kind of look a person gives something they've already decided is irrelevant. She paid the consultation fee in cash and drove back to the carriage house. She sat in her car for a long time with the engine off. She thought about Brennan texting exclamation points about a sale price while a moving crew knocked on her bedroom door. She thought about 11 days in that apartment, eating crackers, watching a parking lot. The anger arrived slowly, the way fire catches on damp wood. Not a burst, a build. Cora got out of the car, braced her shoulder against the left barn door, and pushed until the swollen wood gave way with a groan that sent the nesting bird into the sky. The smell came out first, dense with mold and trap time. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. August's old workbench was still there along the back wall. A wood stove sat in the corner, cast iron, heavy, structurally intact. She looked at her options. The apartment with its thin walls and parking lot view. Her son's voice asking if she was comfortable while his wife planned renovations. The senior community Sabrina had mentioned, with its amenities and its implications. Then she looked at the workbench August had built from reclaimed oak, fitted without nails, sealed with linseed oil every spring. 30 years of disuse and still solid. She drove to the hardware store on Route 9 and bought trash bags, rubber gloves, a respirator mask, a push broom, and 2 industrial bottles of cleaning solution. Big project? The man at the register asked. Getting started on one, Cora said. She drove back, changed into old clothes, pulled on the gloves, fitted the mask, and walked through those barn doors. She started with the raccoon corner. That first afternoon, she filled 9 bags. Her back ached by the third. Her arms shook by the 7th. She stopped twice to sit on August's workbench and breathe. But she kept going. Each bag, dragged outside, felt like an answer to something. Not to Sabrina exactly. Not even to Brennan. To the version of herself that had sat in that apartment for 11 days, waiting for someone to tell her what came next. Nobody was going to tell her. By the time the light went flat outside the broken window, 9 bags sat in a row, and the floor was visible for what felt like the first time in decades. Cora pulled off her gloves, stood in the middle of the room, and looked at what was left. It was a disaster. It was hers. She drove back to the apartment, showered until the hot water ran out, and slept 9 hours without waking once. Cora gave up the apartment on a Monday morning, loaded what she owned in her car in Hetty's borrowed pickup truck, and drove back to Sycamore Ridge for the last time. Hetty followed behind her without asking questions Cora couldn't answer yet. They unloaded everything into the carriage house. A cot, 2 blankets, a camping lantern, a box of kitchen things that had nowhere to be a kitchen yet, her clothes in garbage bags because she hadn't thought to grab her luggage. Hetty carried boxes without comment. When they were done, she stood in the middle of the cleared floor, looked at the water-stained walls and the open sky visible through the caved section of ceiling, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I'm bringing you a space heater tomorrow. It's April, Cora said. It's April in Kentucky, Hetty said. I'm bringing the heater. She left around 6, and Cora sat alone on the cot in the near dark with a camping lantern throwing yellow light across the walls and listened to the sounds the building made. Old wood settling. Wind finding gaps in the siding. Something small moving between the interior and exterior boards. A mouse probably, conducting its own business with no interest in hers. She'd expected to feel afraid. She felt something else instead, something she hadn't felt in 11 days in the apartment or in the months before that, the slow drift of life in the main house, while Sabrina rearranged furniture and talked about equity. She felt awake, alert in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The kind of attention that comes when the situation is real and the choices are yours and nobody is coming to smooth things over. She ate a peanut butter sandwich, read for an hour by lantern light, and went to sleep. The next 2 weeks were about learning what she didn't know, which turned out to be most things. Cora had maintained a house for 31 years. She knew how to patch a screen door and unclog a drain and repaint a room without ruining the trim. Structural repair was different. The carriage house needed work she had no frame of reference for, and the cave roof section alone was beyond anything she could assess without help. She found Silas Drummond through Hetty, who knew everyone in Millhaven the way people who've lived somewhere their whole lives always do. Silas was a contractor in his late 50s who'd spent 30 years restoring old buildings across the county. He came out on a Wednesday, walked the perimeter twice without speaking, went inside, spent 20 minutes examining the walls and ceiling and floor, and came back out. "How old is this structure?" he asked. Cora told him what she knew. August had said it was original to the property, built sometime in the early 1900s, possibly earlier. Silas nodded slowly. "The bones are good. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. The damage is mostly surface and neglect. Nothing structural is compromised except that addition on the side, which was never built right to begin with." He paused. "You planning to live in this?" "I am living in this," Cora said. Silas came back Saturday with a written estimate and a patience for teaching Cora hadn't expected. He walked her through the roof assessment, explained the difference between damaged sheathing and damaged framing, showed her which sections she could repair herself and which needed him. He didn't talk down to her. She spent that weekend on YouTube, watching videos on roof patching, wall framing, moisture barrier installation. Her reading glasses sat on the end of her nose, and her laptop balanced on August's workbench, and she took notes in a spiral notebook she'd bought at the general store. She filled 6 pages that first weekend. Physical work resumed Monday. Silas handled the structural framing repair on the cave section, while Cora worked alongside him, handing tools, learning the sequence, asking questions he answered without impatience. By Wednesday afternoon, the open sky above the addition was closed. She'd helped build that. With her own hands, at 64 years old, she helped put a roof over her own head. The weeks that followed had a rhythm. Mornings for physical work, stripping damaged siding, replacing rotted boards, clearing debris from corners she hadn't reached yet. Afternoons for research and calls to the county building department about permits. Evenings for learning, videos and library books, and growing collections of notes and spiral notebooks that multiplied on August's workbench. Her body protested constantly. Shoulders from overhead work, knees from the ladder. A persistent soreness in her lower back she managed with ibuprofen and the heating pad Hetty had brought. She was not 40. She was not even 50. Her body was honest about the gap between what she was asking and what it was accustomed to providing. She kept going anyway. Hetty came by most evenings, sometimes with food, sometimes just sitting on the overturned bucket Cora had designated as the guest chair. She listened while Cora talked through problems, asked practical questions, never suggested this was a bad idea, never mentioned the apartment or the senior community. Cora called Brennan once in the 3rd week. She told him where she was living. Long pause. "Mom, you're living in the carriage house." "I am. That place isn't livable. I'm making it livable." She could hear Sabrina's voice in the background, low and unintelligible. Then Brennan said, "We can help you find somewhere better. Somewhere with actual facilities." "I have facilities," Cora said. "I have a wood stove and a camping lantern and a roof that doesn't leak anymore. I'll have running water by the end of the month." "I'm fine, Brennan." "Mom, I have to go. I'm in the middle of something." She hung up and went back to the section of interior wall she'd been stripping. The work was hard and her back already ached, and she had no idea what she was going to find behind these walls. But she was about to find out. The interior walls of the carriage house were a record of every decade the building had passed through. The outermost layer was cheap wood paneling from the 1970s. Behind it was badly installed drywall, seams never properly taped. Behind the drywall was the original plaster, cracked and stained with moisture damage that had been painted over rather than fixed, probably more than once. Cora stripped it all back methodically, starting with the east wall where the damage was worst. She wore her respirator and gloves and worked with a pry bar, pulling the paneling away in long strips. The drywall came down in pieces, chalky and damp at the edges. The plaster beneath required a hammer and chisel and a patience she was developing out of necessity. She'd been at the east wall 3 days when she found it. She'd pulled away a section of plaster near the base of the wall and found herself looking at something that didn't match the surrounding structure. The original wall framing was heavy timber, rough-cut lumber that predated milling standards. But in this one section, the space between two studs had been deliberately closed off with a panel of finer wood, fitted carefully and finished with a small wooden latch no bigger than her thumb. Cora crouched and looked at it. Then she pressed her hand flat against sections of the surrounding wall, listening. The section by the latch was hollow. Everything adjacent was solid. She unlatched the panel. It swung open on stiff hinges, the metal dark with age. Behind it was a cavity roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, lined with cedar planking, dry and fragrant despite everything the building had been through. Inside were 3 items. The first was a tin box, rectangular, sealed with a clasp. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of papers. Cora carried them to August's workbench and set them under the work lamp. They were drawings. Detailed architectural drawings on heavy drafting paper, dated 1911. The title read, Proposed Alterations and Expansion, Weston Carriage House and Adjoining Grounds, Millhaven, Georgia. Commissioned by Mr. Clarence Aldridge Weston. Cora read the name twice. Weston, her married name. August's family name. She hadn't known the property had a history going back further than August's parents. August himself had never mentioned it, which meant either he hadn't known or the connection had been lost somewhere between Clarence Aldridge Weston and the man who stood at this workbench sealing oak with linseed oil every spring. She set the drawings aside and opened the second item, a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked and stiff. The entries inside were written in a careful, formal hand. It was a business record. Clarence Weston had operated a carriage repair and livery business from this building beginning in 1903. The ledger documented 8 years of accounts, customer names, services rendered, materials purchased. The last entry was dated October 1911. The third item was a photograph mounted on thick cardboard. A man in his 40s stood in front of the carriage house, which in the photograph looked entirely different from what it had become. The doors were open and 2 carriages were visible inside. A small painted sign hung above the doors. The man stood straight, one hand resting on the door frame, looking at the camera with the composed expression of someone who had built something and knew it. On the back of the photograph, in pencil, faded to near invisibility, C.A. Weston, 1909. What we build lasts longer than we do. Cora sat on the workbench with the photograph in her hands and felt something she hadn't been prepared for. Not excitement, though that came later. Something quieter first. The sense of being handed something that had been waiting a long time to be received. August had put this building in her name alone. She'd assumed it was some administrative quirk of the original filing. But August had grown up in this county. His family had roots going back generations. Had he known what the carriage house held? Had he put in her name deliberately, knowing that if she ever needed it, it would be hers without complication? She would never be able to ask him. That particular grief was familiar by now. She held the photograph a little longer, then set it down gently. She picked up the architectural plans again and studied them properly. The 1911 expansion had never been completed. Accompanying the drawings were 2 letters from a Millhaven businessman proposing a partnership to expand the livery operation. The letters were enthusiastic. Then a single paragraph in Clarence's handwriting. Partnership declined. Poor health prevents expansion at this time. Building to remain, as is until circumstances allow. Circumstances had never allowed. Clarence died. The ledger entries stopped. The plans went into the wall, and the building passed through a century of partial use and abandonment until it landed, through a chain of inheritance nobody had fully mapped, in August's hands and then in hers. That evening, she drove to the Millhaven Public Library and sat at a research terminal for 2 hours. Clarence Aldridge Weston appeared in county records as a business owner from 1901 until his death in 1914. The Carriage house was listed in historical property surveys as one of the oldest remaining commercial structures in Millhaven, a detail nobody had ever acted on. Nobody had looked. Cora drove back, sat on the cot in the lantern light, and opened her spiral notebook to a fresh page. She wrote for an hour. Names, dates, connections, questions still needing answers. When the lantern dimmed, she stopped. She sat in the near dark and thought about what Sabrina had said during the walkthrough. Old outbuilding, no utilities, not worth the hassle. She thought about the photograph of Clarence Weston standing in front of his building with his hand on the door frame. What we build lasts longer than we do. Cora closed the notebook and smiled in the dark, the first real smile and longer than she could accurately remember. She had work to do. The Georgia Historical Preservation Society had an office in Atlanta and a phone number, and when Cora called on a Tuesday morning in early May, a man named Douglas picked up on the third ring and listened to her for 20 minutes without interrupting. She told him about the Carriage house, the age of the structure, the original timber framing, the documents found sealed in the wall cavity, the Weston family connection, the 1911 architectural drawings, the ledger, the photograph with the penciled note. Douglas asked her to repeat the date on the drawings. He asked about the condition of the documents. Then he was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Weston," he said, "I'd like to send someone out to look at this." The assessor arrived 10 days later. Dr. Francis Cho worked in historical architecture and arrived with a camera, a moisture meter, a tablet full of reference documents, and the particular enthusiasm of someone who had found exactly the thing they'd been hoping to find. Francis spent 4 hours in and around the building. She photographed everything, measured the timber dimensions, examined the joinery, cross-referenced construction techniques against her reference materials. She handled the wall cavity documents with cotton gloves. She found 2 details Cora had missed entirely: a maker's mark stamped into one of the original door hinges that dated the hardware to between 1898 and 1905, and a section of original exterior siding preserved under later editions that still bore faint traces of the original paint color, and a partial stenciled letter matching the signage in the 1909 photograph. When Francis was done, she sat with Cora on the overturned buckets and said, "This building is the real thing. If the documentation holds up under formal review, and I believe it will, you're looking at one of the best preserved examples of early commercial vernacular architecture in this county, possibly in this region." Cora had been thinking about this for weeks, turning it over during physical work, letting the idea form slowly the way August had always said good plans should. "I want to restore it properly," she said, "historically accurate where possible, and I want to open it. A working heritage space, demonstrations of traditional crafts and trades tied to the history of what Clarence built here." Francis looked at her steadily. "That's a viable model. There are successful heritage sites built on less documentation than what you have." The formal application took 3 months. Cora worked through it the same way she worked through everything now, methodically, one step at a time, asking questions when she hit walls, finding answers in library databases and county records offices, and calls to people who knew more than she did. Patricia Osei helped navigate the legal dimensions. Francis consulted on the historical documentation. Silas continued the physical restoration alongside Cora, and as weeks passed, she took on more skilled work herself. She learned to read the grain of old timber before cutting. She learned to mix historically accurate lime plaster and apply it in layered coats. She learned which modern materials were acceptable substitutes in preservation work and which weren't. Her hands changed. The softness of the early weeks gave way to something tougher. Calluses formed along her palm where tools sat. She stopped noticing the ache in her shoulders because it had become background noise, the ordinary cost of work she'd chosen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hetty came by on a Saturday in July and stood in the middle of the carriage house, turning slowly. The restored plaster walls, the refinished timber framing, the original floorboards cleaned and treated with the same linseed oil August had used on his workbench. The broken window replaced with period-appropriate glass. The barn doors stripped, repaired, rehung, and treated. The wood stove professionally inspected and restored. August would not believe this, Hetty said quietly. Cora looked around the space with her. Still not finished. The second room was still a work in progress. The exterior needed one more round before winter. The small office space was framed but not plastered. But the building no longer leaned. The walls were solid. The roof held. The floors were level underfoot. The historical designation came through in September. A formal letter from the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office confirming the Weston carriage house had been added to the State Register of Historic Properties. With it came approval for a preservation grant, enough to cover remaining restoration materials and a portion of Silas's labor costs for the final phase. Cora read the letter 3 times at August's workbench. Then she called Frances Cho, who said, "I knew it," before Cora finished her first sentence. The grant also made the property eligible for a federal historic tax credit program. Patricia explained it would provide a significant financial return on the documented restoration expenses Cora had been carefully tracking. She kept every receipt, every invoice, every materials list in a folder grown thick over the months. August had taught her that. Keep your records. Nobody remembers what you spent but you. Autumn came to Millhaven, and the carriage house came with it into something new. The exterior was finished, the cedar siding replaced where necessary and treated to match the original. The barn doors painted deep barn red, matching the color traces Frances had found. A sign made by a local woodworker, simple and period-appropriate. Weston Carriage House, EST 1903. Cora stood in front of it on a quiet October morning with coffee and looked at the sign and the building behind it and the cedar trees that had hidden it from the road for decades. Inside, the 1909 photograph of Clarence Weston hung above the workbench in a simple frame, the penciled inscription transferred to a small card mounted beside it. "What we build lasts longer than we do." Cora looked at it every morning. It had stopped feeling borrowed from a stranger and started feeling addressed specifically to her, across 115 years, from a man who had stood in this same building and decided what he was doing was worth finishing. She intended to agree with him. The Weston Carriage House opened to the public on the first Saturday of March, 14 months after Cora had pushed those barn doors open alone in the April rain. She hadn't planned a grand opening. A notice in the Millhaven Gazette, a post on the County Heritage Society's community board, and Hetty, who told everyone she knew. Cora expected maybe 20 people, 30 if the weather held. 63 showed up. They came through the barn doors she'd repaired with her own hands, stood in the restored main room, and looked at the timber framing and plaster walls and original floorboards and the photograph of Clarence Aldridge Weston above the workbench. They read the historical notes Cora had mounted on the walls. They touched the surface of the workbench with the careful reverence people reserve for things they recognize as genuinely old. Several were older Millhaven residents who remembered the building in various states of disuse. One woman, probably in her mid-80s, looked at the 1909 photograph for a long time and told Cora her grandmother had brought a buggy here for repair in the 1930s, that the Weston place had still been operating then under a different name, that she hadn't thought about it in 50 years. Cora wrote that down. She wrote everything down now. The Heritage Workshop program launched 2 weeks after the opening. The concept was simple: hands-on demonstrations of traditional trades tied to the history of the building and the period it represented. Woodworking, using the original workbench and period-appropriate hand tools. Basic blacksmithing in a small forge area she'd built in the former storage room. Leatherwork. Harness repair, a direct reference to the livery business Clarence had operated. Silas taught the first woodworking session, showing 8 participants how to cut and fit a mortise and tenon joint without power tools, the same joinery technique used in the original framing around them. Cora watched from the back of the room and thought about the first day he'd come out to assess the building, the way he'd said the bones were good. The workshop sessions filled quickly. By April, Cora had a waiting list for the woodworking sessions and had added 2 new programs: a historical document preservation workshop taught by Francis Cho, and a traditional kitchen garden workshop Cora taught herself, drawing on 30 years of growing her own food. A reporter from the regional paper drove down from Atlanta in late April. The article ran the following Sunday: Millhaven woman turns forgotten building into living history. It told the story of the restoration, the documents in the wall, the historical designation, the workshop program. It mentioned, briefly but clearly, that Cora had undertaken the entire project alone after a family dispute left her with nothing but the building itself. The response was more than she'd expected. Emails came from heritage organizations across the state, from historians interested in the Weston family records, from journalists wanting to follow up. Women wrote to her. Quite a few women. Their messages were specific and sometimes long. They wrote about their own situations, their own versions of being handed something nobody wanted and having to decide what to do with it. They wrote about feeling invisible and not knowing what came next, and reading about Cora and feeling that something was possible that hadn't felt possible before. Cora read every message. She answered most of them. It took time she didn't have, but she made the time because the messages deserved it. Hetty read a few of them one evening on the porch, handing the printed pages back one by one without comment. When she'd read the last one, she sat looking out at the cedar trees. "You know what you've built here," she said finally, "and I don't mean the building. You've given people something to point at. When they can't see the way forward themselves, they point at you and say, 'She did it. If she did it, maybe I can too.'" She paused. "That's not nothing, Cora. That's actually quite a lot." In June, the Millhaven Heritage Council invited her to join their board. She accepted. In July, a university history department in Atlanta contacted her about the Weston family ledger and the 1911 drawings, asking to photograph them for their regional history archive. She agreed, on the condition that proper attribution accompanied every use of the images. Patricia helped draft the formal agreement. Cora signed it at August's workbench. A travel writer visited in August and published a piece in a regional lifestyle magazine describing the Weston Carriage House as a destination, a word Cora found slightly startling but recognized as accurate. People were driving to Millhaven specifically for the building and the workshops. The town small bed and breakfast reported an increase in weekend bookings. By September, 18 months after arriving with a respirator mask and 9 trash bags, Cora employed 3 people part-time. Silas taught 2 workshops a month. A young woman from Millhaven named Adiz, who had a background in textile history, taught a monthly session on traditional fabric and natural dyeing. Cora led the kitchen garden workshops and historical tours. The revenue was not large. She was not getting rich, but the Carriage House was self-sustaining, covering its operating costs and generating a modest surplus she reinvested in the property. One evening in October, sitting on the south porch as the light went gold through the cedar trees, Cora opened her laptop and started writing. Not a grant application or a historical summary. Something else. She wrote about the 11 days in the apartment eating crackers. She wrote about pushing the barn doors open alone and smelling decades of abandonment. She wrote about 9 trash bags and the ache in her shoulders and the particular feeling of standing in a ruined building and deciding it was yours. She wrote for 2 hours. When she stopped, she read it back, made a few changes, and posted it to a blog she'd set up that afternoon and never used. By morning, 40 people had read it. By the following evening, 400. By the end of the week, the number had a comma in it. She started writing every week. The message from Brennan came on a Wednesday morning in November, 2 years after the sale of the house on Sycamore Ridge Road. Cora was at the workbench going over supply orders for the winter workshop season when her phone lit up beside her. "Mom, Sabrina and I would like to come by and see what you've done with the place. Been reading about it. Would Saturday work?" Cora read it twice. Then she set the phone face down and finished the supply order. She didn't respond until Thursday evening. "Saturday is fine. Come at 10. They arrived at 10 past. Cora was outside raking leaves from the area around the south porch and watched the car come to a stop and gave herself a moment before walking over. Brennan got out first. He looked tired in a way that wasn't just the drive. His face had the quality of someone who'd been worrying about something for a long time without finding a way to stop. He was thinner than she remembered. He looked at the Carriage house the way people look at things they'd written off and been wrong about, with a complicated expression that mixed surprise and something harder to name. Sabrina stepped out of the passenger side and stood very still, looking at the building. The barn doors painted deep red, the period sign above them, the restored exterior, the south porch with its proper roof, the small garden along the front fence, put to bed for winter but clearly established and intentional. She said nothing at first. That, Cora noted, was new. "Mom." Brennan hugged her, genuinely, which she hadn't expected. She let be genuine. "Come inside," she said. She gave them the same tour she gave everyone, walking them through the main room, explaining the history, showing them the documents from the wall cavity, now housed in archival sleeves in a display case Frances had helped design. She pointed out the maker's mark on the original door hinges. She showed them a 1909 photograph of Clarence Aldridge Weston. Brennan asked real questions, the kind that meant he'd actually looked into what she'd been doing. He asked about the historical designation process, the grant funding, how the workshop program had developed. Cora answered him clearly and without editorializing. Sabrina was quiet through most of it. She read the historical notes on the walls. She stood in front of the display case with the documents longer than Brennan did. Cora made coffee, and they sat around the low table near the wood stove. Outside, November light came flat and gray through the period glass in the restored windows. Brennan wrapped both hands around his mug. "Mom, I owe you an apology. The way things happened with the house. I let Sabrina handle too much of it, and told myself it was practical and didn't think hard enough about what it meant to you." He paused. "That was wrong. I've known it for a while." Sabrina looked at her hands. Then she looked up. "The realtor told us the Carriage house wasn't worth including. I believed that because it was easier to believe it." She stopped. "I didn't treat you fairly, Cordelia. I don't expect you to forgive that. But I wanted to say it directly." Cora held her coffee mug and looked at her daughter-in-law. The apology was real. It had the texture of something that had cost something. She took her time before speaking. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "Both of you." She set her mug down. "What happened happened. I can't unknow it, and you can't undo it. What I can tell you is that I don't carry it the way I did. I'm not angry anymore, at least not in the way that takes up space." Brennan nodded slowly. Sabrina's expression shifted towards something that might have been relief. Then Sabrina said, "The property is incredible, what you've done here. The historical designation, the workshops, the press coverage." She paused. "We were wondering if there might be a way to be involved. Brennan has contacts in heritage tourism development, and I have a background in business operations, and we thought." "No," Cora said, quiet and even. "No particular room for negotiation." Sabrina blinked. "We're not looking for ownership. Just a consulting arrangement, or even—" "Sabrina." Cora's voice stayed level. "You looked at this building and told the realtor it wasn't worth including. You moved me out of my home in 7 days. You found me an apartment I never should have been in." She paused. "I don't say this with anger. I say it because it's the reason the answer is no. What's here I built. Every board, every coat of plaster, every grant application, every workshop session. I built it when I had nothing and no one was helping, and you'd both decided I was someone to manage rather than consider." Brennan's jaw tightened. Not in anger, in recognition. "This isn't something I need help with now," Cora continued. "And bringing in outside business interests, even family ones, would change what it is. This place means what it means because of how it was built." Silence settled around them. The wood stove ticking quietly, the November light flat outside the windows. Brennan said, "I understand." Simply, without argument. Cora believed him. Sabrina said nothing more on the subject. She looked around the room one final time, at the walls and the framing and the photograph of Clarence Weston above the workbench, and Cora thought she saw something move across her face. Not regret exactly. The expression of someone who had made a calculation that turned out to be wrong in ways they hadn't anticipated and were still working out the full cost of. They stayed another 40 minutes. The conversation moved to other things. His children, Cora's grandchildren, whom she wanted to see more. He said he'd bring them in the spring. She said she'd like that. When they stood to leave, Brennan hugged her again at the barn doors. She held on a moment longer this time. Sabrina offered her hand. Cora shook it. She watched their car move back down the gravel path and turn onto the road, then stood in the doorway of the Carriage house, the cold November air moving around her, and felt the particular quiet of something that had been unresolved for 2 years finally settling into its proper shape. Not reconciliation, not the restoration of what had been, but something honest, which was perhaps better. An accounting without illusions. She went back inside, washed the coffee mugs, and sat down at the workbench to finish the supply orders she'd set aside that morning. She had a winter season to prepare for. 3 years after Cordelia Weston pushed open a pair of swollen barn doors alone in the April rain, the Weston Carriage House was listed in the Georgia Heritage Tourism Guide as one of the top 15 historic sites worth visiting in the state. Cora read the listing on her phone at the workbench one morning and then set the phone down and went back to the letter she'd been writing. She didn't make a fuss about it. She told Hetty, who made a fuss on her behalf, which was the right division of labor. The blog, which she'd named What We Build, had grown steadily over 18 months since she'd posted that first piece about 9 trash bags and a ruined building and a decision. She wrote every week without fail, sometimes about the physical work of restoration, sometimes about running a heritage site on a modest budget, sometimes about starting something entirely new at an age when most people she knew were narrowing their lives rather than expanding them. She wrote without softening the hard parts, without performing a version of herself tidier than the truth. The readership had grown to just over 30,000. She still answered comments personally, though it took longer now. The women who wrote to her were from everywhere, different ages, different circumstances, different versions of the same experience of being handed a diminished set of options and having to decide what to do with them. Some were navigating divorces. Some had lost husbands. Some had simply been told by the general drift of culture that the interesting part of their lives was probably behind them. Cora wrote back to as many as she could. She was honest in those responses the way she was honest in the blog. She didn't tell people it was easy or that the anger went away quickly or that there weren't weeks when the whole enterprise felt like a long mistake. She told them what was actually true, that it was hard and worth it, that the hard and the worth it were the same thing and couldn't be separated, that starting over at 64 had cost more than she'd expected and given more than she'd known to want. That, apparently, was the thing that resonated. In the spring of her 3rd year at the Carriage House, Cora was invited to speak at a women's heritage and entrepreneurship conference in Atlanta. She drove down Thursday, stayed one night in a hotel that felt slightly unreal after 3 years of waking up to cedar trees and bird calls, and stood the next morning in front of 240 women. She looked at them for a moment before she began. All ages, though many were over 50. "I'm 67 years old," she said. 3 years ago, I was living on a cot in a building with no running water and a partially caved roof, and I was cleaning up after raccoons, and I thought I had lost everything." She paused. "I was wrong about that last part, but I was right about everything else." Laughter moved through the room, genuine and warm. She talked for 40 minutes. She told the story without the parts smoothed over, without skipping the 11 days in the apartment or Brennan saying that place isn't livable or the first night on the cot wondering whether any of this made sense. She talked about Clarence Aldridge Weston and the penciled note on the back of a photograph and what it meant to find it at the bottom of the worst year of her life. She talked about Silas and Hetty and Francis and what it meant to have people who showed up without being asked. She talked about Sabrina and Brennan coming to the Carriage House in November, the conversation at the wood stove, what she'd said and why. She talked about August, that part she hadn't planned to include, but it came out anyway. She talked about the workbench he'd built from reclaimed oak and sealed with linseed oil every spring, how it had survived 30 years of disuse and was still solid, how she'd understood something about him and about herself when she first ran her hand across its surface in the beam of a camping lantern. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. Afterward, women lined up to talk to her. She stayed 2 hours past the scheduled end of the event, hearing 30 versions of 30 different situations, listening to each one without rushing it. She drove back to Millhaven that evening. The cedar trees were dark against the last light when she turned up the gravel path. The barn doors were closed, the sign visible in her headlights. Weston Carriage House, EST 1903. Brennan brought his children that spring, as he'd promised. 2 kids, 8 and 11, who ran their hands along the original timber framing and asked questions in the rapid way children ask when something has genuinely caught their attention. Cora answered everyone. She took them to the kitchen garden and let them pull the first radishes of the season from the ground with their bare hands. The 11-year-old, a girl named Clara, stood in front of the photograph of Clarence Aldridge Weston for a long time. Then she pointed at the card beside it with the penciled inscription. "Did he really write that?" she asked. "He really wrote that," Cora said. Clara looked at the photograph a moment longer. "Is that why you kept his name on the sign? Because he built it first?" "Partly," Cora said, "and partly because what he started I finished." That seemed worth acknowledging. Clara considered this with the seriousness it deserved, then moved on to the next thing, carrying the answer with her without making a production of it. On a quiet evening in late May, 3 years and 2 months after she'd first arrived, Cora sat on the south porch with a glass of wine and watched the last light go out of the sky above the cedar trees. The carriage house was warm behind her, the wood stove banked low, the workshop materials for tomorrow's session laid out on the workbench. She raised her glass to the evening air, to August and to Clarence, and to the building that had waited 120 years for someone to come back and finish what had been started. She was 67 years old, stronger than she'd been at 47, more herself than at any point in the careful, diminished years of being someone's background. The cedar trees moved in the evening wind. The first fireflies of the season were starting up along the fence line. More than enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.